The most famous of the fathers was Augustine, 354 to 430 AD. Augustine, early in his life, belonged to one particular sect known as the Manichees, about which I'll comment in a few minutes. Then he became a skeptic for a while, just on the order of the ones we mentioned last lecture. Then he discovered Plotinus, and he was very much taken by Plotinus, and that softened him up for a mystic experience, which he had at the age of 32, and he became a devout Christian thereafter. Augustine represents the first real philosopher of Christianity. He is enormously influential on its subsequent development. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that his influence simply cannot be overestimated. He attempts to synthesize all the dogmas and practices of Christianity in one all-embracing philosophy, which became for centuries the philosophy of Christianity. So let us settle down now on Augustine and look at his philosophy systematically, with occasional excursions where necessary to earlier or later figures of this era. And first, his epistemology. In general, Augustine follows Plato. Strictly speaking, he says, we can never have knowledge of this world. This world is a world of change, a world of flux. True knowledge must be of immutable truths and Platonic forms. Knowledge is of reality, not of this semi-real reflection of reality in which we live and which we perceive through our senses. The information we acquire from the senses, he says, has practical value in daily living, but strictly speaking, it never gives us knowledge because, as Plato pointed out, all we can get through the senses is belief. Well, if true knowledge for Augustine, as for Plato, consists of turning away from the physical world and sensory observation and studying immutable truths and Platonic forms, that, of course, implies that Augustine endorsed Plato's view of a realm of forms, and so he did. As a Christian, however, he didn't believe that the world of forms existed independently of God, because on Christian premises, nothing can exist independent of God. So Augustine followed Plotinus on this point and thought of the forms as merely thoughts in the mind of God. God's mind becomes, in effect, a spiritual home in which reside all the Platonic forms. True knowledge consists of turning away from this world and discovering the forms in God's mind. Thus, for Augustine, when you study mathematics or morality, for instance, you are studying unchanging and universal laws or truths, and that means you are studying the relations of immutable universals, and that means you are studying the thoughts of God. So, in effect, mathematics, ethics, etc. are branches of divine psychology. If there were no God, there would be no such subjects. Indeed, there would be no knowledge at all. It would be like Plato without the world of form. Now, how do you gain this knowledge of the thoughts of God? Plato had said you have a reminiscence of a preceding life, that you'd been there. Augustine is not permitted to take this view on Christian grounds. It is orthodoxy that there was no pre-existence of the soul. But then we have the question, if we can't gain the knowledge of God's thoughts through our senses, and we have no means of direct access to God's thought here on earth, how is knowledge possible? Augustine's answer is, God himself must communicate the truths to us. He must impress certain basic notions on the human mind and thereby enable man to discover the truth. Man, therefore, is ultimately dependent on God for all knowledge. He's dependent on a special act of divine illumination, as it is called, illumination. And I quote Numenius, another figure of the period, quote, all knowledge is the kindling of the small light from the great light who illumines the world, unquote. In this respect, man is epistemologically passive and helpless, dependent on God's act for any knowledge he has. Left to his own devices, deprived of God's aid, man could claim nothing as knowledge. Now, in fundamental terms, as you see, this is the Platonic approach to epistemology. Knowledge is contact with the supernatural dimension of essences. It is not the study of this world on the basis of sense experience. But Plato was a Greek, and as such he held that given your pre-existence in the world of forms, you didn't, once you were on earth, need any new illumination from the beyond. Sense perception and reasoning to stimulate your reminiscence was all that was required on earth, culminating, of course, in a mystic vision. Augustine makes man much more helpless, much more dependent on the supernatural than Plato ever dreamed of doing. As a Greek, you see, Plato had to see firsthand. He had to acquire truth by a personal excursion. Before this life, of course, but nevertheless a personal excursion to the world of forms to see for himself and acquire knowledge he could trust. Augustine, in a much more religious age, demands acceptance of God's illumination, of God's word. If, as is the case, you have no way to verify it yourself, he demands acceptance on faith. Plato asked for individual mystic insight, but not faith in somebody else's revelations. Augustine demands faith, faith as such, acceptance of God's word as reported in Scripture. Now, I may say here parenthetically that I think Augustine is the more consistent of the two on their common premises, because they both agree, Plato and Augustine, that man is a metaphysical dependent, simply a shadow or image of another world. Well, then in consistency, he must be an epistemological dependent also. In other words, dependent upon divine illumination for all knowledge. Plato tries to combine the Greek first-handed, rational epistemological independence with the metaphysics which subverts the individual. Augustine is more consistent. In metaphysics, man is a shadow, and in epistemology, his duty is to accept the word of the true reality when it is delivered to him. His duty is to have faith. So Augustine's epistemology is the Platonic line combined with a sense of the acute helplessness and utter dependence of man on God. The more distinctively Christian side comes out, therefore, in Augustine's discussion of faith, which means belief or acceptance in the absence of understanding, of rational evidence or proof. Augustine's main point is, in regard to faith, that no man can set his own reason up as a judge of the truth or falsehood of Christian teachings. To do so would be to rely on one's puny intellect and commit the sin of intellectual pride. That which God has revealed to man must be accepted on faith. It must never be doubted. It must be assented to because it comes from God, even if you don't understand why it's true. Once one has done this, once one starts with the faith, one should then, says Augustine, go on and try to make sense of it, try to understand it. But this is the proper procedure and order of acquiring knowledge. First believe, and then try so far as you can to understand. Quote, in a famous line, quote, one must first believe in order that one may then know, unquote. You see, the rational policy would, of course, be the exact reverse of that. And Augustine says, if you can understand, fine, give thanks to God. If not, recognize your limitations, recognize that God's truth is rational and he could illuminate you with the answers if he chose, but if he doesn't choose, you have no grounds to object. The analogy is sometimes given to Augustine and his followers and predecessors who take this line, that they regard the process of acquiring knowledge like a student with a math text. The answers are written at the back of the text. You take the answer as given and try and work it out. If you can reach the answer in the back, fine. If you can't, you start over and you say, I must be doing something wrong because I knew the answer in advance. And of course, in this text, there's no misprints. God printed the answers, you see. In this respect, philosophy is the handmaiden of theology, the rationalizer of theology. And you see, this is a fundamental contrast with the most mystical even of the Greeks, even with Plotinus. Now, I note here in passing that anti-rational as this attitude is, other Christians took an even more anti-reason view. Augustine at least held that God's revelations are intelligible in theory, if only God gave us the necessary illumination, and that we should try to make sense of them. Others, however, held that the basic tenets of Christianity were inherently irrational, contradictory, and preposterous. Other believing Christians, and indeed they held their preposterousness was the sure sign that they were true. I mention in passing Tertullian, Tertullian, who is 2nd to 3rd century AD, one of the fathers of the church. He was asked about a certain Christian dogma in which he devoutly believed. Did he think it made sense? And he replied in a famous line, credo quia absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd. It is certain because it is impossible. In other words, he was putting in as strong a way as he could the idea that he is having no truck with reason. Reason is a corrupt, distorting element, and if this view is irrational, that's good grounds to think it's true. This is always taken as an overt anti-reason manifesto. And it, of course, is the version of early Christianity that the existentialists today most admire. They find their inspiration not in Augustine, whom they regard as too rational, but in Tertullian. This is explicit. Now let's look at Augustine's metaphysics. Here the central concept is Augustine's concept of God, which is a mixture of many elements, as you would expect. God is in part an infinite mind containing the Platonic forms. So to that extent, he's like Plotinus' divine mind. Augustine describes him as fully real, and of course God is the only fully real entity. He is immutable, perfect, etc. He's just like Plato's other world, or like the form of the good. But that isn't all he is, because this is a religion now. And consequently, God can't be just a neutral Platonic set of universals. He must be given a personality. And so Augustine describes him as a living, knowing, willing being, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, the father of his children, who loves them, who protects them, who judges them, who sends his son down to help them, etc. Now, most of this is straight out of the mystery cults of the time, and it's largely the primitive Judaic inheritance, not nearly as sophisticated as the Platonic inheritance. Now, besides trying to combine God as a neutral Platonic world with God as a kind of infinite personality, Christianity also had the problem that many of the mystery cults of the period had: how to conceive the Trinity, the Trinitarian nature of God. How to relate God the Father to Jesus the Son, leaving out the third one. Now, Christianity, of course, construes Jesus as a divine being, the Son of God, and therefore a God himself. He was, however, the Son of God, and therefore a different God from God the Father. So there are now two gods. And yet, with its Judaic inheritance, Christianity is committed fervently to monotheism. Some of the other mystery cults were avowedly polytheistic. Now, this is a terrible problem. And it's worse when you add the third member of the Trinity. Now you have three beings. Each must be distinct from the other two. Each are God, and yet there's only one God. The ultimate position was, adopted formally by the Church, was that this is a mystery which surpasses human understanding, which must be accepted on faith. How one can be three and still be one. There was a lot of debate about it at the time. There were some, before the doctrine was finally settled, there were some people influenced by the Greek pro-reason view who were trying desperately to make sense of the Trinity. And there were others influenced by the primitive Hebraic worship of blind faith, and they wanted avowedly unintelligible positions, and they won out. I may say as a parenthetical remark that most of the countless heresies on countless subjects express this tension between the Judaic and the Greek influence on Christianity. And in every case that I'm familiar with, Judaism is the source of the worst, most irrational element in Christianity, Greek philosophy of the better, more rational elements. In any event, I don't mean that Judaism is Trinitarian, I mean the worship of faith. In any event, you see now the incredible problem Augustine had with God. He has to try to make some kind of coherence, if not sense, out of a being who has to combine a motionless, Neoplatonic divine mind, the primitive Judaic loving personal Father, and the Christian Trinity, which is and isn't three. Now you can appreciate Augustine's view stated on occasion that God is not really knowable or understandable to the human mind. The best we can do is approximate its nature. In any case, God, in Augustine's view, created this world ex nihilo, out of nothing, by an act of will at a particular point in time. Here again is a profound contrast with any Greek view. All the Greeks, Plotinus included, believed that the universe was eternal, that its constituent elements had always existed. Here was another case where the Judaic view won out over the Greek. And as always, it created monumental problems for the Christians. The ancient pagans taunted the Christians. They ask questions like, if God came before the stuff of the universe, why did he decide to create it at the particular point in time he did? Why not sooner? Why not later? What was he waiting around for, in effect? And why did he choose this particular place to put it in rather than some other one, etc.? Now, to answer such questions, and for many other reasons as well, Augustine advanced a famous theory of the nature of time. Unfortunately, I have no time to present it. Ask in the question period if you're interested, but please do, because it's important. In any event, God did create the world ex nihilo at a specific point in time, and he did so for a specific purpose. God has a plan. He runs every aspect of what occurs in the universe as part of his plan. Indeed, according to Augustine, God alone really has causal efficacy in the universe. Everything is determined by God. For instance, in his Confessions, Augustine remarks when he tells about a journey that he took, you might think on the surface that he, Augustine, decided to take it, and he is the real cause of the journey. No, Augustine says, really, God behind the scenes wanted Augustine to take it and was responsible for the journey as part of his plan for Augustine. Or Augustine relates a case where he gets a toothache and explains that God is punishing him in accordance with God's own long-range plan, and so on. God is responsible for everything which occurs. And since he's immutable, no changes in his plan are possible. It's set and fixed once and for all. Everything, in a word, is predestined in accord with this plan. And from this aspect, Augustine is a rigid religious determinist. Now, this view is best expressed in the following parallel, which will give you the feel of this way of looking at the universe. The universe on this view is no longer a natural fact, no longer a primary, no longer intelligible in its own terms. It's like a play, rather, written by God, who becomes a cosmic playwright. The earth, the physical world, is the stage. Man is the chief actor. His lines have been written by God, who is also the sole spectator. The play is taking place once and for all. At a certain point, it will conclude. That's the end of the world. And the actors will retire for their critical notices. Now, you see the absolute contrast with the Greek view. The universe is not eternal, not natural, not a self-intelligible fact, but a specially created unnatural episode in the scheme of things. If you asked a typical Greek, for instance, in this respect, Aristotle, what is the meaning of life? Now, if you asked it in a metaphysical, not an ethical context, if you asked him ethically, and you meant by what should man live for, of course he'd have a lot to say. But if you just pointed to the phenomenon and said, what is its metaphysical or cosmic meaning, Aristotle would not understand the question. He would point to a rock and say, what is the meaning of a rock? What do you want it to mean? It's there, period. But on the Christian view, life on earth is like a play by Shakespeare. And it becomes meaningful to ask, what does it mean? In effect, what did the author have in mind? On this view, the fact of existence is not a primary but a mystery which requires some kind of unraveling. Everything is a symbol pointing beyond itself to God. Well, to go on, we have the problem now of evil in acute form. Because the question arises, why did God include so much evil, so much suffering in his play? Now, one sect of the period, the Manichees, that's the sect that I mentioned Augustine belonged to as a youth, thought that the only solution was to say that God is limited, that there is a devil and he is responsible for evil, which at least makes a certain kind of sense. Christianity repudiated this as heretical. Its view is that God is responsible for everything. He is all-powerful, and even the devil, therefore, is part of his plan. Why then does God create or allow evil? Well, part of the time, Augustine takes the view that there is no evil. If you saw God's ultimate purpose, you would see that everything is really good. That's a point we discussed last time. But much more typically, Augustine takes the Neoplatonic solution to the problem of evil. You remember, evil is the absence of the perfection and reality that is inherent in the creature being non-God. All things in this world are necessarily infected with deficiency, with a metaphysical deficiency, because they are part of the semi-real created world. If you want a pun, but which nevertheless is meant literally here, they're made out of nothing, and therefore they're deficient. This harks back to the Platonic view of non-being as the constituent element of this world and as the source of imperfection. God, from this point of view, couldn't have created a perfect world, a world without evil, because if you think of him as the source of light, we're now at the region where it's dark. It follows that all men, insofar as they are semi-real members of this semi-real world, are also inherently infected with evil. Men are sinners by nature, and they have no choice about it. They can do nothing about it on their own. Their evil is inherent in the metaphysical setup. Notice here that the Church and Augustine accepted this view fully. They explicitly denied that man on his own has any choice about being good, that it is not an issue up to him. He is helplessly evil by birth. And that, of course, is the doctrine of original sin. This became official with the condemnation of Pelagius, P-E-L-A-G-I-U-S. He was an early 5th century Christian monk, Pelagius was, and he held that each human soul enters the world sinless, that it has free will, is capable on its own of shaping its destiny by its own choices, and therefore is responsible for its actions and properly to be judged by God. Pelagius denied any intrinsic wickedness in man. This view was formally condemned as a heresy, and of course is to this day, because it made man too independent of God. The reasoning was, if man could achieve virtue on his own, by his own will, then virtue would be his accomplishment, not God's. And it wouldn't therefore be true that everything was caused by God. And besides, the whole Christian scheme of Christ coming to earth and being crucified to redeem man would become unnecessary then. If man has free will to achieve virtue on his own, he wouldn't need to be saved by divine intercession. He wouldn't need any help from beyond or from the church. And yet Christ is supposed to be the Savior without which man is lost. And it is essential, therefore, to Christianity, this doctrine. And therefore Pelagius was condemned, and the doctrine was taken that man on his own, without help from God, is inherently corrupt, wicked, and helpless. He cannot take a step in the direction of virtue on his own. Now this, of course, is determinism, and Christianity in this respect is fully deterministic. Free will is incompatible with man's inherent evil. It's incompatible, further I might add, with God's rigid predestination, with the doctrine that only God has causal efficacy, that everything's a part of his play, and that man is merely a puppet pulled by the strings worked by God. If man has free will, what happens to this view that God determines everything that occurs? To say nothing of what happens to the view that God knows in advance everything that will occur. So if Christianity from this point of view is thoroughly deterministic on many counts, it is, however, incapable of accepting determinism consistently for other reasons. Because if it did, how would you praise or blame man? How can God hold him responsible, hold man responsible, for playing the part that God wrote him? How can God hold man responsible for an evil he couldn't have avoided? If there's no free will, isn't it hopelessly unfair for God to praise and condemn? Isn't it senseless for God to promulgate moral rules? Isn't it unfair for him to send men to heaven or hell? Christianity is therefore caught in a desperate problem. There must be absolute determinism. There must be free will. Now, if we had several weeks, I would indicate some of the devices by which Augustine tried to combine these two, to have his free will while eating it too. However, we haven't the time, and it is not important. The fact is there is no possible solution on his premises, and every solution Augustine gives, he contradicts elsewhere. I'll confine myself merely to giving one view of his on this question, which he took over in essence from Paul. Namely, at certain points, Augustine limits free will to Adam. Adam, he claims, was free to choose whether to obey God or not. Adam committed the original sin, the first sin. And this was then inherited by all of his descendants. So now we have no choice. But still, God validly punishes us because our first ancestor sinned volitionally. And this is the line that many, many Christians took. For instance, Milton, among many others, took it. And the whole of Paradise Lost is devoted to elaborating this view of the solution to the problem of freedom. It is, of course, a hopeless solution because it simply takes the question back to, was Adam free? And the same considerations as to why no man can have free will on this philosophy apply equally to Adam. Was it possible for Adam to have used his free will such as to be perfectly moral and virtuous? Well, if so, the Neoplatonist answer to evil is wrong. That means evil is not inherent in the metaphysical setup. If the sin were really Adam's, then it's not God who is responsible, and so God is not the author of everything that occurs, and so on. And moreover, even supposing you solve this problem, where is the justice in condemning all men for the sin of one? No intelligible answer has ever been given to this. That is a dogma which must be accepted on faith. On the issues of evil and freedom, therefore, the upshot is a mass of contradictions in Augustine and in Christianity. It goes like this. God is the cause of everything that's good. In fact, he's the cause of everything since he is the omnipotent author of every event. And yet he is not responsible for evil. This world and man are inherently evil since they are not God and are therefore metaphysically defective, semi-real. And yet man is responsible for his sins and properly to be condemned by God for them. Man is helpless to be virtuous on his own, yet he is to bear responsibility for vices he cannot alter. These are the foundations with which we enter ethics. But first, one crucial metaphysical tenet of Augustine's that I have stated but not yet stressed. Namely that as a Platonist, a Neoplatonist, Augustine agrees profoundly with Plato and Plotinus that this world in which we live is not fully real. It is a kind of shadowy reflection of true reality. In other words, of the realm of God. This world is not a solid, substantial, real dimension. It's hard to communicate this perspective. It is you have to view the world as a region of comparative darkness, far removed from the light and perfection which constitutes reality. It's like a transitory drifting haze against the solid background of supernatural light. If you say you don't agree with this, matter is solid, it's real, it's there, Augustine answers in a famous formulation, well, yes, of course, matter is there, it exists, but it is essentially the absence of God. So it is prope nihil, which is Latin for almost nothing. That's his definition of matter. Almost nothing. You try to keep this view in mind and you'll have no difficulty grasping Augustine's ethics, to which we now turn.